In the origin of beginnings was the Ark, an all-powerful relic which transcended the planes of reality. In the raw, chaotic state of existence of this dimension stood Zazma, the god of chaos. Then would appear Regulus, the god of order, who became the one to control the Ark's power and used it to manifest order within his newly established cosmos. He fabricated the very universe our world situated itself within with this power, calling it Omnium, and from there would go on to dot the galaxies with many worlds. But only one would foster the creation of life, and this was the very world we inhabit today, Elgacia. The creation of life was not without its consequences, however. By creating the very concept of life, Regulus had also birthed the concept of death as well, an equivalent not so dissimilar to his countenance to Zazma. This is a novel idea to keep within your mind as you listen to this tale. Light and darkness, order and chaos, life and death, good and evil. These are the radical categories that are not mutually exclusive. It's an important theme that the story of Lost Ark guides itself along. Elgacia was populated with life through the efforts of Regulus's godly creations. Regulus would take the Ark and split it into 7 fragments, each held by a god of his own creation. The god of honor, Pleccia, who was seated closest to Regulus himself, would create the Lazaneth. The winged race were created in the image of the supreme god of order himself, and were blessed with the gift of flight, tasked with overseeing the events of the world from the skies. The goddess of wisdom, Skeptrum, would create the long-eared Sylvain. Graceful in appearance and tempered in worldview, the elven race were particularly gifted in wielding sorcery and magics. The god of fire, Antares, created the Hal. Cunning and resourceful, masters of strategies and the most fearsome in battle. The Hal were often considered the mightiest of the mortal races, both in combat strength as well as technologically. The god of life, Aldebaran, populated the world with creatures and spirits. This provided bountiful food and protection for the other races. The god of earth, Arcturus, created the Umar and the giants. The dwarven masters of the forge would rapidly push forward the industrial progression of the world, constructing tall castle walls and tempering powerful weapons. The goddess of life, Gienna, would be the one who filled the seas of Elgacia and would also create the Posita to dwell within them. Gienna would also create the Nia, a tribe whose chieftain would adopt the very same name, as well as the Yaz, an isolated race isolated in the southeast Rimeria Isles. Secluded and xenophobic, the Yaz guard their own secrets and hold the ability to commune with all life on the planet. They are split between North and South Rimeria. All Yaz bear features of a specific animal on birth that they carry throughout their lives. Those who were born in South Rimeria are often smaller in stature, taking after critters such as rabbits, squirrels, and foxes. Those born in the North, on the other hand, often would take after larger animals such as deer or tigers. The god of ice, Sirius, would create the Tabr, a race indigenous to the cold landscapes to the far north. Gienna would also create hand-in-hand with Sirius the race of humans. Cursed with no particularly redeeming features or powers, humanity would prove to be the most adaptable and versatile of the many inhabitants of the planet. Though despite the many races that lived on Elgacia, only 3 truly were blessed with God's favor. The Lazaneth, the Sylvain, and the Hal would ultimately be the 3 creations which would mainly rule the Star of Life. Each wielded immense power or knowledge that the other races did not have. While each of the 3 were individually powerful, this also served to keep one another in check, until one fateful day. History wrote that the Hal, the cunning race created by Antares, deceived the god of fire and relinquished his piece of the Ark from him. With this power, the Hal threatened the very balance of powers of the world, forcing the Lazaneth and the Sylvain to take action. However, despite their best efforts, their combined strength would not be enough to overcome the Hal. This forced the hand of the Lazaneth, who in a desperate maneuver infiltrated the realm of the gods and stole the power of the Ark that belonged to their creator, Pleccia. With this, they were able to stop the Hal's advance and put an end to their campaign to dominate Elgacia. But the events of this turmoil did not go unnoticed. Regulus, who witnessed what had transpired, was outraged by his creations and their offspring. Firstly, he punished the Hal, who had deceived their own god, by sentencing them to genocide. He would have the Hal eradicated from all of existence for their treachery. To Antares, Regulus's own creation, who had been fooled by the race that he had given life to, he was expelled from the domain of the gods, stripped of his name and godhood. His fate remains unknown. To the Lazanith, the race whom Regulus favored most, he crippled their wings so they may never experience the joy of flight again, but would have them keep their wings as a reminder of their sin. He also imprisoned them in the floating isles of Elgacia, never to leave. To Procyon, who allowed his fragment of the Ark to be stolen, he would strip the god of language, sentencing him to eternal silence. Finally, to prevent this from ever happening again, he forbade any of the gods from interfering with mortal affairs, moving forward, locking them away in a faraway realm. This turmoil would also have an unintended side effect on Omnium itself. Whereas Elgacia existed within Omnium, there exists another plane where darkness and chaos resides. This place is the home of Petrania, the dark star which Zazma governed. Petrania was a lawless land that bred pure chaos. It was the very antithesis to the order that Regulus hoped to create with Elgacia. However, Zazma, who coveted the power of the Ark, yearned for something as everlasting as primal light. When the battle between the races of Elgacia reached its climax, a rift formed between the dimensions, creating a bridge that allowed Zazma and his army to invade in search of the fragments of the Ark. This led to a devastating conflict between the mortal races, the gods, and the creatures of Petrania over who would seize the Ark. There were irreversible consequences from this unnamed war, such as Sirius annihilating the lush and prosperous Shushire, covering it with a permanent frost that would never melt, also that Zazma's forces would be stopped in their tracks. The ends to justify the means. The fighting escalated further and further, creating more and more instability in Omnium, which was beginning to pull Petrania into its fold. Had the war continued, there lived a very real threat of the planets crashing into one another and Omnium itself collapsing. Zazma, the first to notice the catastrophe ensuing, called for a truce with his counterpart Regulus. The latter agreed, and the two gods would use the Ark to create the Guardians. These powerful creatures, composed of order and chaos within each of their bodies, had the power to restore the cracks that were forming in Omnium, restoring the world and the universe as a whole to a stable state. Zazma, aware of the repercussions of his actions, retreated back into the rift, back to the Star of Darkness. With the world peaceful, the Guardians, whose sole purpose was to keep the Star of Life, Elgacia, safe, would enter a deep slumber. They would only awaken again if they felt the world was in jeopardy once more. At the same time, when Petrania had nearly pulled into Omnium, another anomaly occurred. As the dimensions were starting to fuse into one another, it created a separate plane of existence called the Abyss. Here, the souls of those deceased traveled to lay to rest, which made it into an underworld for the departed. As Zazma returned to Petrania, he found that a new rift had formed that led to the Abyss. From its depths rose a new being that called himself Kazeros. Kazeros sought to usurp power from Zazma, who had already been weakened after the war with Regulus, and rapidly established order within Petrania. Zazma's power derived from the essence of chaos, and so this very act would further weaken him. Aware of the danger that Kazeros presented, Zazma sought to use the power of primal darkness to forcibly turn those who had been led towards order back to chaos. However, as he confronted Kazeros, Zazma would be betrayed by the very ones who existed from the beginning beside him, as his closest advisors would side with Kazeros in this battle. A weakened Zazma was swiftly defeated by Kazeros and his former allies. Few would notice, however, as the defeated god fell, splinters of his very being would fly off towards Blackrock Mountain and the Abyss respectively. It would be an agent of chaos known by the moniker Kakul Saintone that would mask his escape. Despite turning traitor and allying himself with Kazeros, Kakul was still the catalyst that would allow Zazma to continue existing. His motives remain unknown even to this day. Kazeros, having deposed the former ruler of Petrania, would begin to build up his army. His intent was clear. He too sought the power of the Ark. Those that would not rally beneath his rule would be eliminated, and he would cultivate a new race to inhabit Petrania called demons that would be completely subservient to his rule. This would be a race whose source of strength was the horns adorned on their body. In order to obtain the Ark, though, Kazeros had no choice but to wait for an opportunity to cross into Omnium. The same strategy that Zazma had. To this end, a sorceress named the Witch of Chaos, also known as the Last Survivor, had a prophecy that she passed on to Kazeros. When the light of the red moon has waned, the dimensions will be warped. The red moon, an artificial sun created by the gods of darkness, those that once served Zazma that now swore their allegiance to Kazeros, granted the demons great strength when basked in its moonlight. However, unlike the sun, the red moon was finite and would one day extinguish its light. And when that moment happened, the time to cross into Omnium would finally come. During this time, Kazeros would build a mighty army, to which he would bequeath the primal powers to each of his presiding generals. The Phantom Legion, led by the Ice Witch Belshazzar, would represent Primal Nightmare. Among the commanders, she was the most intelligent and cunning. The Plague Legion, led by the Lord of Death, Akan. Akan once ruled over another region of Petrania known as Carthion, where his devilish scythe, Atrox, would drain the life of all those who stepped within its void. He would yield to the more powerful Kazeros and obtain the powers of primal disease. The Beast Legion, led by the mighty Vultan, within the Blackrock Mountains of Petrania, was a never-ending war between ferocious beasts. The one who stood at the apex was Vultan, a behemoth of a minotaur who wore the skull of his rival Drakal on his shoulder. The Covetous Legion was originally led by the beautiful temptress Echidna. However, Echidna herself would come to desire being seated closest to Kazeros among the commanders and sent her minion Vicus to assassinate Belshazzar. However, Vicus would be tempted herself by the promise of power and betrayed Echidna, siding with Belshazzar and turning the ploy against her former master. With the vacancy of the commander of the Covetous Legion open, Belshazzar recommended Vicus to the post. The Covetous Legion represented the power of primal desire. Next, the sinister Saintone, one of the primordial beings that betrayed Zazma and in secret had also helped Zazma's soul splinters escape, went to Kazeros demanding to be one of the top commanders. Kazeros initially rejected this request, but eventually gave in to Kukul's persistent annoyances, granting him command of the Mayhem Legion. Kukul's army would be the weakest one, but also the largest. They represented primal madness. Lastly, there was one more commander in Kazeros' army, an extremely powerful being who had conquered half of Petrania on his own, known only as Thamine. Kazeros, along with Belshazzar, appeared before him, granting him the power of primal darkness. This act also imparted the curse of oblivion onto Thamine, stripping him of his memories and forcing him to become subservient to Kazeros as his most powerful warrior. With his army ever growing, Kazeros patiently awaited the day of the Red Moon's dying light. Returning to Arcacia, the world was at peace after the first recorded war between Regulus and Zazma. Vahal had disappeared, with the only evidence that they ever existed in the first place being ruins of their past civilization found in Punica, where the Nia tribe presides, as well as in Kurzan, which at this time was uninhabited. Over the next 500 years, humanity continued to progress very quickly, establishing the Church of Sacria, an order which directly worshipped Regulus himself. This order was led by Archon Thermer II, one of the few who even still remembered the existence of the Ark. The Ark's fragments remained in Arcacia even despite the absence of the gods. However, as hundreds of years passed since the previous conflicts over them, many of those who were still alive had forgotten about the Ark. Archon Thermer II would secretly send his agents to investigate potential leads related to the location of the scattered Ark fragments. It would later be known that Sacria was a divisive order with two prominent factions within the Holy State. They were known as the Dawn Priests and the Twilight Priests, respectively, with the latter of the two being a far more extremist group within Sacria. Archon Thermer II eventually passed of old age long before his investigations would turn up any meaningful results. His successor and son, Archon Thermer III, however, later discovered his research into the Ark and continued his father's ambitions. Far more resourceful and ruthless compared to his late father, he wound up finding several leads to the fragments of the Ark. To the king of the Federation of Rethramis and the leader of the continent of Shushire, he ordered by the decree of God that the fragment of the Ark be handed over. Both complied without any conflict. Another piece of the Ark was situated at the top of Mount Kurzan, an active volcano, and he would send countless of his paladins to their early demise to retrieve it. Their corpses and ashes still litter the mountainside to this day. Next, he sought out the Posita tribe, whom he knew were in grave peril due to the seas having been contaminated, threatening their very livelihoods. In exchange for their fragment, he offered a sacred relic from the holy capital Rasamoa's vaults, an artifact of divine origin called Gienna's Tears, which could cleanse away the deadly pollutants of the ocean. This trade between the Posita and Sacria would largely be considered the starting point of the next major war between Arcacia's civilizations. With the Ark obtained from the Posita tribe, Sacria then sought out the great giant Domarek. The Archon had learned that within the belly of this colossal titan was another fragment of the Ark. Through planned murder, Thermer III led an army to slay Domarek and rip the fragment from his stomach. That led Thermer III to the final piece of the Ark that he was missing, and undoubtedly the most difficult one to obtain. Nested deep within the Queen's Gardens of Rohendel was the final piece of the Ark. The Sylvain were the last of the mighty three races of distant yore. The Hal were extinct and the Lazaneth were caged within Elgacia, and so the strongest of Arcacia's races were the Sylvain at this point. Invading would do no good, but Thermer III had a nefarious plan concocting. He was aware that the giants, particularly Domarek, had a friendly relation with the Sylvain. Thermer III planned to disguise the passing of Domarek as one that had no relation to Sacria whatsoever. He would send ambassadors from the holy capital, delivering the heart of the dear friend of Rohendel's queen, and use that diplomatic maneuver as a way to infiltrate the Queen's Garden and steal the last fragment of the Ark. The Sacrian diplomats did manage to sneak into the Queen's Garden and abscond with the fragment. However, on their way out, they were discovered by innocent Sylvain attendants of the Queen. They chose the violent way out and killed them in cold blood to eliminate any witnesses. Despite that, they would be caught in the act by the Queen herself. She would take this as the gravest offense possible, as they had not only lied about Domarek's death, they also sought to steal the Ark, all while murdering innocent Sylvain while trying to cover their trail. This event directly led to a declaration of war, and began what would be known in history as the Short but Violent Hollow War. Named after the hollow fruit, a fruit indigenous to Punica and Rimeria, the fruit itself is completely empty. The war was named after it since nobody had anything to gain from it. There was nothing to conquer, there was no great prize to the victor. It was a war that was completely devoid of any meaning and only served to kill those that invited malice. The Umar, the Giants, and the Elementals would side with Rohendel. Sacria would force the Federation of Rethramis, Shushire, Gian, and Filigar to side with them. To Rethramis, they were forced by the merit of religion. To Shushire, they were goaded by the promise of another sacred relic, an undying flame that could be key to their survival in the permanently frozen landscape that they lived in. To Filigar, whom they had already made an exchange with for Gienna's Tears, they were already indebted to Sacria. It's not known why Gian sided with Sacria, but after the events of the upcoming war, their existence would slowly be forgotten by the people of other regions. Despite the tremendous army that Sacria amassed, upon arrival at the shores of Rohendel, they quickly met their match at the hands of Azena, Rohendel's queen. They had greatly underestimated just how powerful the Sylvain, one of the ancient races, actually were. In a desperate measure, Thermer III tried to unleash the power of the Ark to turn the tides of war, but the primordial relic did not respond to his plea despite him having gathered all of the fragments. He could not understand what was missing. With the intense war ongoing, the turbulent world began to violently quake from all of the bloodshed. The Guardians, who had been asleep for nearly 500 years at this point, began to awaken. Vergris, the progenitor of all Guardians, swiftly flew to the capital of Sacria, Rasamoa, and incinerated the lands with fiery breath, killing Therma III and wresting the Ark from the hands of humans. The Guardians had determined at this point that the mortal races were a threat to the Star of Life. Rohendel and Sacria had no choice but to call a ceasefire to prevent their utter annihilation at the hand of the Guardians. At this point, though, the damage had been done. Unbeknownst to everyone, the cracks in the dimension began widening again, just as they had 500 years prior during the unnamed war between the Hal and everyone else. The Guardians, feeling like they had accomplished their mission by stopping the war, had to make an important decision about the fate of the mortals. They could either return to slumber or annihilate them if they felt they would cause problems again in the future. Of the Guardians, only 3 had the power of free will and thought. They were Vergris, the father of all Guardians, Luen, who was relatively neutral, and Varkan, who erred towards the side of chaos. Varkan felt like in order to protect Arcacia, they must exterminate all of the mortals. Luen advocated to let them be, and ultimately Vergris would side with Luen on the matter. Before they could return to their rest, though, one of the Guardians returned with a report that one of their own had been slain. This news sent Varkan into a seething rage, and he quickly flew to the site of where one of his subordinates lay dead at the hand of a silver-haired swordsman. There, the two engaged in battle, one that lasted 10 days and 10 nights without a victor. This bout would be what would push the cracks in the dimension to warp enough to form a bridge, one that the Lord of the Abyss in Petrania had long awaited. Varkan had no choice but to return to his fellow Guardians, but before he did, he would ask the name of the swordsman, who would return in kind, Kadan. With the bridge now formed, demons began pouring out of holes in the sky, invading Arcacia's soil. At the forefront of the demons' incursion was the Darkness Legion led by Thamine, who quickly overwhelmed the tired and downtrodden mortal races who had just ended the Hollow War. The last time the world had been invaded 500 years ago, the mortal races were saved by divine intervention from their gods. However, as the beaten, worn, and defeated mortals cried to the sky for the gods to save them, they heard no response. The gods had abandoned them. In their moment of peril, it would be the Guardians who would step in and save the mortals, but not because they cared for them, rather because they recognized the demon advance as the greatest threat to the Star of Life. Vergris clashed with Kazeros himself, while Varkan held Thamine at bay. But the stalemate did not last long, as the gods of darkness would enter the battlefield and manifest a new red moon in the sky, throwing the demonic army into a frenzy and greatly bolstering their strength, pushing back the Guardians into a corner. Varkan, who had witnessed the awe-inspiring power of chaos firsthand, also submitted to Kazeros and betrayed his kin, bringing along the Guardians of Chaos to serve under Kazeros in the world's darkest hour. When all hope seemed lost, then appeared on the battlefield a shining star. The gallant knight Lutera arrived with his party of Arcacia's strongest alongside him, the Queen of Rohendel Azena, the master martial artist Cien, the blacksmith legend Galator, the wise Yaz Elder Shandi, the sword of the Lazanith Nineveh, and the guardian slayer himself, Kadan. Their appearance overturned the tide of battle, pushing it back into a stalemate as they joined alongside the remaining Guardians to press back the empowered demons. Of the many battles that took place, the fiercest one was between Kadan and Thamine. The mightiest warriors from both sides of the war were locked in a clash that would scar the lands underneath them. Kadan, despite being the strongest of the mortals, would barely be able to fend off the vicious onslaught of Thamine's attacks. Azena dealt with the commander of the Phantom Legion, Belshazzar. Galator squared off against the Minotaur Vultan. Nineveh handled the succubus Vicus, Shandi versus the maddening clown Kukul Saintone, and Cien against the Lich Akan. Meanwhile, Lutera, the leader of Arcacia's last hope, would stand alongside Vergris to deal with the Lord of the Abyss himself. Despite their best efforts, however, they were still no match for Kazeros, which prompted Vergris to resort to their final trump card. He called for Mystic, the Ark Carrier Guardian, to retrieve the fragments of the Ark from the Guardian's nest. They would barely manage to hold off the demons long enough for the Ark to arrive and be passed into Lutera's hands. Through the power of the Ark, Lutera manages to unleash the all-powerful Primal Light, summoning powerful chains that bound Kazeros down. Recognizing that he had been fully restrained by the very relic he sought to capture, Kazeros split his soul from his corporal form and escaped back into the rift with his army, resulting in victory for the mortal races. This decision to seal away Kazeros instead of killing him wasn't without controversy, however. His allies vehemently chastised him for not using the Ark, which they knew had limitless power, to simply destroy Kazeros. But Lutera saw something that they did not. He saw beyond the current happenings of the world and made a decision that only he could have known to make. Lutera saw the cycle of history repeating itself and knew that had he destroyed Kazeros, the same chaos would invite itself back into Arcacia in the future. He needed humanity to break away from the repeating chain of events that was occurring, but he knew that he himself was powerless to do it with a mere human's lifespan. This would begin Lutera's 500-year plan, something that only he could do, and something that would take many years after his final years to accomplish. Of his allies, he had one person that supported him, the silver-haired swordsman Kadan. Everyone else reluctantly agreed to a plan that they were unaware of. The Ark dismantled after Lutera used it, splitting into 7 fragments once more. Lutera hoped that the tragic events of humanity inspired by the greed of man would not transpire again, and so he entrusted each piece of the Ark to a different sidereal to hide away. History called the band of heroes that saved Arcacia that day as the sidereals, named after the constellations in the night sky. This was the end of the Chain War, an event that transpired 500 years after the unnamed War of the Gods and 500 years before the start of today's events. But what happened between then and now? Kazeros' corpse, still bound and chained by the power of the Ark, was thrown into Mount Antares in Kurzan, the very volcano that was the gravesite of thousands of fallen paladins sent to their demise by Therma III, now also housed the body of the Lord of the Abyss. Despite the omnipotent power of the Ark, however, the chains that bound Kazeros' flesh were gradually weakening over time. The Guardians, who suffered a great loss by losing Varkon and the Guardians of Chaos to Kazeros, entrusted the rebuilding of the world to humanity and left to return to their slumber. Rowen, however, pleaded with Vergris to oversee the development of humanity, to which Vergris obliged. Sidereal Cien and his followers traveled east and established the city of Anika, located above Gien. This was a land that was already inhabited by Rowen, who was resting after suffering serious injuries during the Chain War. Rowen would grant them permission to build their new home in Anika, so long as no human entered his lair. Rowen feared that the injury inflicted on him could corrupt him, potentially causing him to turn to chaos. Sidereal Cien himself was a practitioner of a martial art called Siwa. In the past, he had sealed a world-threatening catastrophe known as Dochol in his arm. In times of battle, he could call upon the chaotic powers of Dochol to overwhelm his opponents. During the Chain War, he was the only sidereal to completely decimate his opponent. Against Akan, Cien ripped out his horns and gouged out Akan's eyes and heart from his body, forcing the demon commander to retreat and preparing for a resurrection that would take hundreds of years. However, after they settled in Anika, there came a day where Cien would temporarily lose control of Dochol. Rowen, noticing the instability in Cien, tried to help him, but his own wounds would fester as a result, leaking a deadly miasma across Anika that caused the inhabitants to attack one another. Their blood scent in the air would draw the attention of demons that failed to retreat back to Petrania that wandered the lands. While they managed to fend off the demons, Cien entrusted Anika to his fellow martial artists and retreated to Prisma Valley to stay near Rowen, where they could keep each other in check to avoid harm coming to others. Cien's accomplishments did not end there, however. He later hid the fragment of the Ark Karta in Phaeton, entrusting it to a friend he made named Zyka. When they first met, Cien defeated Zyka in battle and helped him learn how to control his powers, similar to how Cien suppressed Dochul, which later led to Zyka founding the Avesta of Phaeton. Cien, however, was mortal, and a human at that. The lifespan of a human among the many races of Arcacia is one of the shortest. And so, as Cien passed, he passed along his martial arts and the crucial role of sealing Dochul to his successor. This role would one day be passed on to Wei, another promising martial artist, whose master Sai would later choose him to inherit the weighty task. To the northwest was the newly founded country of Phaeton, a desolate place, home only to outcasts, who had succumbed to the power of the Red Moon. These were once mortals that had gained the power and ferocity of that of demons, and because of that were generally feared by the other races and deemed exiles by the Holy Church. To escape persecution and extermination by the Church, they fled to this barren, gloomy land where life struggled to thrive. The Delane, whose name means abandoned, splintered into different factions. There were those who sought to suppress their demonic urges, believing that it was necessary in order to not lose control. But there were others that felt like they needed to give in to those powers, as they would be needed in the battles to come. Those who fell into the latter would depart from Phaeton and eventually settle in the country of Kurzan, a similarly barren place where they could hide from the prying eyes of the world. The anguished Delane cursed the many that persecuted them. They hated the Sacrian Order, which sought to exterminate them, and whose Twilight Order would later be found kidnapping and experimenting on the Delane. They despised Kazeros, who was the main culprit for why they ended up this way in the first place. They sought to channel that power, that hate, to fuel their vengeance. Sacria itself was not without its own problems in the aftermath of the war. The first order of business was reconstructing the holy capital of Rasamoa after Vergers razed it to the ground. Many who followed the Holy Order began to recognize the corruption that grew under Archon Therma III. A long campaign would occur to expunge the Twilight Priests from the shadows. It would work for a time, but no matter how much they tried, traces of the Dark Order would continue to exist from the recesses that none could reach. Many of the priests also began to embrace the pursuit of knowledge and science over religion. These blasphemous movements would lead to their excommunication from the Holy State. This led to two camps of refugees who would later settle based on their differing beliefs in the pursuit of knowledge. The ones that settled to the southwest eventually established the city of Voldis, an advanced civilization whose primary goal was the collection of all knowledge in the world. They kept the darkest secrets in the forbidden library they called Umbella. The sages of Voldis were also practitioners of the Golden Path, a unique power that coursed explosive magic through their veins. The other faction of knowledge seekers made their way to the red sands of Arthetine, next to Kurzan. There they established their capital called Tatrich. As the civilization and technology grew and industry developed, they would move the capital to the city of Stern, which later became the most technologically advanced city in Arcacia. In this futuristic city, many embraced the idea that the flesh is weak, to embrace the machine and replace their body parts with metal and their blood with blue fuel. These cyborgs called themselves Psykin. Finally, Lutera, who had returned to Rethramis, eventually united the city-states of the Federation under a single monarchy. The efforts of Lutera resounded throughout the world for the next 500 years as the mortal races continued to prosper in times of peace. But waiting in the midst, disembodied soul from flesh, was Kazeros, plotting his return and his revenge, to finish what he started and lay claim to the Ark. Regardless of the origin of your story, your path eventually takes you to Trua, the Forgotten Land. It is here that you discover your fate as the new inheritor of the Ark. Summoned to Trixian, a place high above that watches over the land, your story to save Arcacia begins here. Beatrice, a Lazaneth who was selected to become a watcher of the world's fate, sends you on a mission to collect the scattered fragments of the Ark that were hidden by the Sidereals hundreds of years prior. At your first destination in Prideholm, you encounter and rescue a Sacrian priest by the name of Armin. Together, you make for the church in the nearby town of Prideholm in search of clues to locate the first Ark. Here within the church is a stone tablet with clues written on it that lead to the piece of the Ark that the late King Lutera had hidden. Unfortunately, a piece of it had been stolen by bandits in a nearby cave. Fighting through the bandit crew, you witness a tall, gaunt figure wielding a staff rendezvousing with their leader. Carmine, an agent of the demons, quickly absconds back to Prideholm with the piece of the stone tablet, leaving the bandit leader to deal with you. Hurrying back to Prideholm, you find the town in a state of chaos. Everything is on fire, and the townspeople are under siege by demons. Battling your way to the church while also protecting helpless citizens, you eventually make your way to where the stone tablet is, confronting Carmine. Armin, at this point, reveals himself to be a Delane, manifesting his demonic powers to overwhelm Carmine and send him retreating. With new knowledge from the completed tablet, your journey takes you east to the deserts of Eudia. There, in the ruins of Morai, the former capital of the ancient Encavia kingdom, you discover the Sword Seal, one of the keys needed to access the resting place of the late sidereal Lutera. Traveling further through Rethramis, you make contact with the outcasted prince of Lutera, Thirain. He was removed from his own castle by his uncle and the current lord of the region, Sherrit. Unable to unlock the power of the late King Lutera's sword Vanquisher, Thirain sees himself as a failure, but is ushered by his peers to retake the castle and the throne. In the confrontation that follows, Demon Beast Commander Volten is summoned to support Sherritt's side and immediately recognizes Vanquisher, as it was the very same sword that once inflicted a grave wound upon him 500 years ago. He taunts Thirain for not being able to manifest Vanquisher's true power, which leads to Thirain's awakening. But before they could clash, Carmine appears and dismisses Volten from the battlefield before taking his own exit. With Vanquisher's potential unlocked, the prince's force encroached on Lutera Castle, aiming to take back the throne from the corrupt Lord Sherrit. The castle's siege gives way as you, Armin, and Thirain approach the throne room where Sherrit awaits. Having made a deal with the demons, Sherrit tries to turn you over to his side, only to be struck down in the process. Carmine once again summons Commander Volten into the fray, who after a short bout defeats you. But through the combined powers of a transformed Armin and the light of Vanquisher, a powerful blow is dealt to Volten that sends him reeling. This was enough to allow Carmine to intervene, betraying Volten and absorbing the commander's power before disappearing. With Sherrit defeated and the incumbent regime surrendered, Prince Thirain takes the throne and the city is retaken under his rightful rule. Peace was eventually restored to Rethramis, and your search for Lutera's tomb brings you to Lastra Forest, where the resting place of the late king awaits. Thirain entrusts the Eagle Seal, an heirloom of the royal family, to you, which provides you both the necessary keys needed to enter the royal tomb. It's there that the first of the fragments of the Ark is discovered, Asta, the Ark of Trust. The spirit of old King Lutera appears, telling you that there are 6 more fragments to recover and that the fate of the world depends on the success of your mission. However, in the wake of Volten's defeat, the Legion commanders under Kazeros' order begin to maneuver. Vicus heads to Annika to prepare a vessel that could serve as a body for Kazeros. Belshazzar goes to Rohendel, where she claims she has unfinished business. Kakul Saintone, mocking Volten for his failure, decides to take matters into his own hands and directly confront the band of heroes in Rethramis. Thus, Kakul arrives in eastern Lutera, where the influence of his madness quickly encroaches on the citizens of that region. This culminates in an all-out assault from the Mayhem Legion at the Borea estate, where Kakul is finally defeated. The weakened Kakul demands that Carmine opens a portal back to Petrania so that he can recover his wounds. But Carmine, much like against Volten, betrays Kakul and absorbs his powers. While he does manage to manifest some of Kakul's powers, Kakul manages to survive this ordeal, as his other half Saintone uses the power of the shadows to bring him back to life in a weakened state. Carmine and Kakul part ways here as Carmine gained new power and Kakul decided to change his goals now that the others believed him to be dead. He would be freely able to operate without rousing any suspicion. With news of the invasion, the holy capital of Sacria dispatches Executor Solus, a priest secretly aligned with the Twilight faction, to investigate what is happening in that region. Solus corners a group of Luteran citizens that he deems corrupted by the demons' influence and sentences them to death. Armin arrives, protesting that they are not a threat and not diseased. Solus dismisses his pleas and kills them all on the spot regardless, sending Armin into a demonic frenzy and resulting in the destruction of all of Sacria's emissaries, including Solus himself. You and King Thyrane arrive on the scene and witness the ordeal, pleading with Armin to provide a reason as to why he murdered ambassadors of the Holy Capital. Anything to prove his innocence so that they don't frame him as guilty for this transgression. Armin, broken and having given up on humanity after years and years of trauma resurfacing, leaves with Carmine and abandons everyone. With heavy losses, you must carry on the mission of locating the Arks. Doing so requires a vessel worthy of seafaring, which brings you face to face with Blackfang, one of the pirate lords of the sea. Thyrane offers to parley with Blackfang, working together in order to commandeer a boat for you. There are 4 lords of the seas in Arcacia. They each lead their own faction and seek the treasure of the missing pirate king Bloodclaw. Because of this, the seas themselves are turbulent with conflict between the lords, with the Redfin pirates under Red Calamity Narkiel being the most notoriously violent. After commandeering a boat hidden in a pirate alcove, you set sail to Wisdom Island to the south. There, knowledge about the heart of the giant Tortoik is learned, and the next destination is set. Arriving at Tortoik, the influence of the Redfin pirates is already clear. Many of them are found attacking the local Makoko people who inhabit the island. After saving the Makoko people, you make your way to the heart of the island, which serves as the resting place of the Ark of Creation, Ortus. After overcoming the giant's trial and obtaining the Ark, the voice of the sidereal Nineveh is heard, who entrusts you with the Ark and mentions that one day the two of you will meet. Traveling further east, you arrive at the Eastern Cultural City and home to many martial artists, Anika. Here, a tournament of power is being held to crown the first sword of Chenghun. However, behind the scenes, the demon commander Vicus is preparing sacrifices in order to summon a creature from the abyss to serve as Kazeros' vessel. She manipulates the desires of Habek, the current champion, for her own devices. After obtaining all the components needed, she summons Banda from the fold and attempts to use him to destroy you. Wei, the successor of the late sidereal Cien, comes to your aid to deal with Vicus to help you make your escape. Successfully foiling Vicus' plan, you learn that there is no Ark in Anika, but that your next destination would be the technological city of Arthatine. Wei also comes to terms with his responsibilities as the new sidereal and embarks on his own journey, finally leaving Anika in the capable hands of its martial artists. Sailing north, the hero arrives at the port of the Arid Path, where the tram takes them to the capital of Stern. There, you learn that a terrorist group under the command of former head of technology Kraus was attempting to take control of a powerful device called the Verdentier, a tower with the ability to create an artificial sun. Kraus was a radical who firmly believed that only they could control their own fates, and so they had to take power into their own hands in order to stave off the impending darkness. To that end, he sought to turn himself into a god, since the gods of the old world had abandoned them. This was an idea that was considered too radical, and the leaders of Arthatine sought to oppose his plans. Kraus believed that despite the means, what he was doing was the right thing if it meant he could protect Arthatine in the end. Ultimately, he and his allies meet their end by your hand at the apex of the Verdentier. For stopping Kraus's madness, the city entrusts the Ark of Prescience, Agaton, to you. This was the Ark that was hidden by the Umar Sidereal Galator in the past. The next stop would be to find the Ark hidden in Shoeshire by Sidereal Shandy. However, upon trying to sail there, you realize that your boat cannot breach the sheets of ice that block the route to the icy continent, and so a detour is taken to the city at the center of the world, Vern. Upon arrival, the port is in a state of disarray under attack by the undead. An ancient necromancer from a century ago had returned to the world of the living alongside the demonic dragon Garum. However, unexpectedly, there was another person who was resurrected. The former commander of the Solar Knights of Vern, Thar, who had came to the hero's aid to repel Sigmund and Garum. Entering the city itself, you become acquainted with the Queen Aelin, as well as the leader of the Lunar Knights, Avel. With Thar resurrected, the focus is then put on foiling the scheme of his arch-nemesis Sigmund. Sigmund's plan to detonate a magical core which would completely obliterate Vern and the surrounding area. While the hero succeeds in defeating Sigmund, they're unable to defuse the magic core. With no options remaining, the hero and Thar are helpless to prevent the destruction of the continent. But just then, a colossal dragon arrives at the scene, who Thar immediately recognizes as the progenitor of all guardians, Vergris. The dragon speaks directly to the inheritor, telling them that it is the duty of the guardians to reset the world when its safety is put in jeopardy. Vergris asks the hero to travel to the homeland of the Lazanith, Elgacia, where they will have to prove that the mortal races are worthy of being spared. Vergris then departs, but not before deactivating the magic core, saving the continent from assured destruction. With the safety of Vern achieved, the icebreaker is given as a promised reward, a mighty seafaring vessel that could easily pierce through the Arctic Sea. The cold lands of Shushire are ruthless and unforgiving. Decimated by the god of ice Sirius 1,000 years prior during the first recorded war against the god of chaos, Zazma, Shushire is perpetually frozen in a layer of ice that will never melt. Because of this, its inhabitants must persevere through difficult conditions, leading many to end up as slaves and gladiators, fighting for the amusement of the wealthy that control those lands. The cruel and unjust Vrad, who operates the gladiator arena, makes an appearance in a nearby town. Vrad deviously loans out money to struggling people, and when they're unable to pay it back, he enslaves them and forces them to die a dog's death in the gladiator's arena. A tall and proud warrior by the name of Jean Madnick stands up against him, and he is taken away, offering himself in place of a woman who wasn't able to pay her debts. Making their way to the arena, you join Madnick in staving off Vrad's wild beasts, but before the two of you are able to deal with Vrad himself, he beckons the Lord of Decay and Legion Commander Akan. Akan, who seeks to locate the Ark hidden by Sidereal Shandy, uses Vrad in order to find its whereabouts. Having served his usefulness, Vrad finds himself becoming food for demonic insects. The trail brings you to a mystical place called the Maze of Mirrors, where the Ark of Hope, Elpon, resides. This was a labyrinth set up by the Yaz sage Shandy, made to keep the Ark away from those who sought it. Akan, who desired the Ark in order to absorb its power to gain an everlasting body, is thwarted by you and forced to retreat. The Mage Scion, recognizing that the Ark is too great of a power for Shushire to protect, entrusts it with the inheritor. With Shushire left in good hands, you depart to the far west, towards the land of the Sylvain Rohendel. This was the home of the elven masters of magic, who kept themselves isolated for many years in the aftermath of the Chain War that had occurred 500 years prior. Not long after arriving, you meet the famed sorceress and queen of Rohendel, Azena. A catastrophe many centuries prior led to the untimely death of her sister Inanna. However, the world tree Elzewin was able to bind the soul of her sister to her, making it so that two souls inhabited a single body. Lurking in the shadows, a devious plot was being put in motion by the Phantom Legion commander Belshazzar. The object of Azena's hatred, Belshazzar sought to bring destruction to the Sylvain by orchestrating a plan that involved deceiving the elemental masters of Rohendel. Belshazzar uses her illusory magic to trick the elemental masters of Rohendel into thinking that Queen Azena was working against the Sylvain race. At every turn, Belshazzar seems one step ahead of the hero until finally facing off against her in the Phantom Palace. Defeating Belshazzar with the help of the Queen forces her to retreat, where you then arrive at the roots of Elzewin and obtain the Ark of Wisdom, Ratik. The journey then takes you south to the homeland of the mighty Umar, the world's finest craftsmen and blacksmiths. Upon arriving, you overhear rumors of a serial killer on the loose who wields a sword capable of stealing the life essence of its victims. Traveling to the great castle in the heart of Yorn, you meet the descendant of the legendary blacksmith Sidereal Galator. He is drowning himself in alcohol, wallowing in his failure to live up to his great ancestor. The sword ends up being located, and its demonic powers devour the life essence of the many demons that try to wield it, including the rumored serial killer that the hero heard about when they had arrived. The sword, Velcruz, was the product of two dwarven blacksmiths that experimented with demonic power. Even after defeating the wielder of Velcruz, the sword survives and ends up in the hands of Carmine, who easily tames the sword despite its attempt to consume him. Before departing from Yorn, Balthor, the descendant of Galator, spirited with new confidence, repairs Thyrane's broken sword, Vanquisher. Sailing north brings you to the desecrated land, Phaeton. Here, you come in contact with a member of the Avesta, an organized syndicate that looks after exiled Delaine and seeks to teach them how to control their demonic urges. Sacria had once again dispatched a battalion of priests led by a powerful member of the church, Jederico. Under the suspicion that the Delaine were colluding with demons, they apprehend the leader of the Avesta, Zyka. You learn that some of the Delaine desired to break free from the rules that Zyka imposed on them, instead electing to embrace chaos and the power of the demonic urges. Zyka explains that he himself would regularly manifest these powers as a means of protecting his kind so that those around him would not have to. Despite reuniting Zyka with the Avesta, a far greater danger looms over the horizon as the Black Rain approaches. Zyka, who had learned that the Black Rain was an omen of death from his old friend Sidereal Cien, prepared the Delaine for a battle that could be their last. You plead with Jederico of the Sacrian Order to support the forces of Phaeton, as without the help of the priests, they would be overwhelmed by demons. Jederico refuses to the request, leaving the fate of the Delaine to themselves. As the Black Rain begins its descent, hordes of demons spill out of the Chaos Gates onto the barren land. For a short while, the Delaine are able to hold them at bay, but find themselves cornered in no time. When all hope seems lost, a blinding ray of light fell upon the demons, repelling them and giving the Delaine much-needed breathing room. Jederico and the Dawn Priests arrive, having changed their mind in order to help the Delaine. For a while, the combined forces are able to stave off the invasion, when suddenly, it had stopped, and the demons gazed up towards the sky. An imposing figure descended from up above, the Master of Darkness and the most powerful of Kazeros' Legion commanders, had arrived. Thamine, in a single motion, swept the battlefield in a cloud of deadly miasma, vaporizing anyone that was unlucky to be caught in it. Thamine deduced that which he sought was not present on the battlefield. The commander was prepared to leave, but not before unleashing a deadly cloud of darkness that would likely wipe out the remaining Delaine and the priests. Zyka, in an act of self-sacrifice, stood before Thamine and chose to absorb the darkness within his own body to protect everyone else. This would be too much for him to handle, and the darkness would consume him, forcing him to rely on the hero to put him down and save his own people. In his final moments, he reflected on how all his life he was treated as a demon, but he hoped that in his greatest moment that he died not as a monster, but as a human. After the funeral, a message is passed along to you leading to the location of the Ark of Devotion, Karta. This was the fragment of the Ark that was hidden in a grove here by Sidereal Cien, who had befriended Zyka in the past and helped guide the Delaine toward a path of self-preservation. After the events of Phaeton, Allegro, a wandering minstrel that had once taught you the song to teleport back to Beatrice and Trixion, instructs you to awaken the sleeping sidereal Nineveh. She was struck by Thamine 500 years ago in her wing, and after the war fell into a long slumber to recover the damage and prevent the corruption of the wound on Whispering Isle. Hers was the voice that was heard when you overcame Tortoic's trial and obtained the Ark of Creation, or Tus. Nineveh, a master archer and one of the Lazineth's greatest warriors, would become the one fated to walk alongside the inheritor in their destiny. Sailing south in search of the final fragment of the Ark, the ship is caught in a violent sea storm, and you end up washed onto the sunny shores of Punica, an island inhabited by the Nia tribe, an ancient group of people created by Gianna. You find that the lands are being influenced by the same peril that plagued Lutera in the past. The forces of the Mayhem Legion were present and actively turning the people of Punica mad. The sinister Saintone, weakened, held the chief of the Nia captive. After saving her, you then investigate the whereabouts of the village's chief of medicine, Nagi. You manage to rescue her from the vices of one of Kakul's followers, Seto. Afterwards, you trace the whereabouts of Kakul to the seed of the island. Kakul sought to absorb the essence of the seed to regain his vitality, since he was still weakened after his confrontation with Carmine back in Rethramis. Kakul corrupts the protector guardian of the island, Albion. The ancient creature goes on a rampage, threatening the safety of Punica's villagers. Nia, summoning the courage to face the protector of the island, sings an ancient song that has the power to quell Albion's rage. While Kakul managed to escape with what he wanted, at the very least, Punica was saved. You are then summoned by Nineveh, who wants you to locate the last member of the Sidereals, Kadan. Heralded as the strongest of the mortal races, he was a key part in the Chain War 500 years ago, but went into hiding after Kazeros' defeat. With the help of the other Sidereals, the trail leads to Asteri Island, a remote fishing hamlet in the middle of nowhere in the ocean. Kadan had hidden himself here, living as a vagabond. However, as you locate Kadan and persuade him to resume his sidereal duties, Asteri Island is suddenly ambushed by a slew of Chaos Guardians, forcing Kadan to take action to protect the people he put at risk just by being there. After protecting the island's inhabitants and repelling the Chaos Guardians, Kadan decided to leave Asteri Island, taking on the mantle of a sidereal once more. After the events of Punica, you are summoned back to North Vern by Queen Aelin. Avel, the captain of the Lunar Knights, had gone missing while investigating problems in South Vern, and the Senate was beginning to maneuver with the intent of undermining the authority of the Queen. Aelin requested that you locate the missing Avel. With the help of the Guildmaster of the Adventurers Guild, Gideon, you were assigned a mage guide named Zarion to accompany you in South Vern. Zarion, who was once formerly a Solar Knight under the Captain Thar, had gone through a great deal of trauma after he had deserted his military post in the past. This haunted him as he believed it led to the demise of many of his companions. Ludwig, a former ally of his, placed much blame on him for the fate of their fellow knights, branding him as a traitor. The Inheritor aims to reunite the Solar Knights after the Senate betrays Vern, helping the demons of Petrania by lowering the barriers protecting the city. The demons, having tricked the members of the Senate, disposed of their pawns after they served their purpose. With the barrier lowered, the Legion commanders were poised to begin their invasion of Arcacia. Zarion, in an attempt to redeem himself, sacrifices his own life so that you and your allies could escape the Legion commanders. Thar, the former commander of the Solar Knights, still resurrected, took command of the reunited regiment, rallying them under his banner to prepare for the counteroffensive. With the main focus of the invasion occurring at the center of the world, Allied forces whom the hero had helped in the past sent reinforcements to bolster the defense against the demonic invasion. Warriors from every continent and all the Sidereals rallied at one point to fight them off. This begins the Allied forces' counteroffensive against Kazeros' Legion commanders, with an active plan put into motion to defeat each of the key leaders of the demon army, one by one. Volton, who had previously been defeated in Lutera and absorbed by Carmine, had his soul resurrected by a Khan, forced to serve as minion under the Lord of Decay. Once he was defeated, Volton's soul once again dissipated into nothingness. Vicus returns to Annika, where she begins sowing discord in the continent once again. In her final desperate moments, Vicus attempts to command the covetous domain to do her bidding, only to realize that it will not listen to her, and she is instead consumed by it. Saintone was no longer a Legion commander. However, he instead invites you to the Midnight Circus in an attempt to gauge whether or not you are growing strong enough to complete your mission. Satisfied with the results of his test, Kakul gracefully exits, leaving the hero to their own devices. Belshazzar, the most cunning of all the commanders, would require the full coordinated efforts of all the Sidereals. She sought to obtain Astalgia, a vital component to fulfill the prophecy of the Witch of Chaos. This was a physical construct manifested by primal nightmare, accumulating negative energy in the world. The Allied forces are able to repel her, but in the end are unable to thwart her mission, and she's able to successfully deliver Astalgia to Kazeros. Nostalgia would be used by Akan to summon the Red Moon in Arcacia. After attempting to deal with Belshazzar, you take a detour to investigate the problems in Rowen. When arriving at the port, there are already issues as the local Tarunian tribes are attacking the colonists that have occupied near the port. Those besieged describe the aggressors as lawless savages. Among those who are encamped is a Sacrian missionary paladin by the name of Osphir. Despite being an enemy of the Tarunian, Osphir encounters and saves one of their archers by the name of Danica from danger. Together, they investigate the Tarunian, only to find that the colonists have been the main aggressors all this time, having captured and enslaved innocents to mine precious Silmail bloodstone from quarries. As the hero earns an opportunity to get better acquainted with the Tarunian tribe, they attempt to mend wounds between factions by establishing diplomacy between the tribes and the Sacrians. The Tarunians consider it, but are subsequently double-crossed by the Sacrians, who take to slaughtering the tribesmen. Osphir, unable to overcome the deep-rooted brainwashing that his holy order performed on him, becomes an enemy in the end, believing that the Twilight Priests are in the right. His actions summon reinforcements from the Twilight Order to ambush an already weakened Tarunian tribe, forcing them to the edge of the cliffside before systematically murdering children, adults, and elders indiscriminately. You and the surviving Tarunian are forced to flee and try to figure a new plan to cross the fog and head towards the tribe's promised land, Starsgard. In the final confrontation, Mion, the Tarunian chief, is able to take down the Twilight Archbishop Wilhelm, who had infused himself with Silmail bloodstone. However, his life is taken by a treacherous Osphir, who, despite having his life spared by the Tarunian archer Danica just moments prior, attempts to stab the hero in the back. Mion shoves them out of the way and takes the dagger to his chest, sacrificing himself. Mion asks the hero to take his people to Starsgard, a place of great importance to the Tarunian, to which they agree to the dying chief's request. The story of the surviving tribesmen traveling to Starsgard will continue in a future episode. Before resuming the campaign against the Legion commanders, you are summoned back to Whispering Isle by Nineveh. Kadan is also present, and they plan to travel to Elgacia, the land of the Lazanith, in order to recruit them in the conflict ahead against Kazeros. The trio travel to the sealed gateway guarded by the mighty sea guardian Alaric. However, Kadan easily overwhelms Alaric, forcing the path to Elgacia open. Nineveh summons Albion, and the three mount the winged guardian to ascend into the sky. Arriving at the gates of Elgacia's capital, Arianor, the three are met by one of the swords of the Lazanith and childhood friend of Nineveh, Azakiel. Kadan is also welcomed back, albeit coldly. While catching up with old comrades, you and Nineveh learn that one of the other swords, Diogenes, had gone missing not long ago, and in his place at the council now stood the cold and logical Prunya. At the convening of the swords, the Lazaneth's strongest warriors, Nineveh pleads to her old comrades, asking them to lend their support to the mortal races in the upcoming war against Kazeros. L'Oreal, the leader of the swords for the past millennia, summons an edict from the gods, who prohibit them from leaving Elgacia. It was the same revelation that prevented their intervention in the chain war that had occurred 500 years prior. Despite Nineveh's protests, L'Oreal stands by the decision and dismisses the case. Azakiel calls for Nineveh and the hero and reveals to them that he is investigating the disappearance of Diogenes. Diogenes was looking into a phenomenon called the Light's Judgment, but would end up painting a target on his own back for looking in places where he shouldn't have. Azakiel also mentions how in the 500 years where Nineveh had left Elgacia, the Round Table of Swords had been entirely taken over by L'Oreal. While accompanying Nineveh on her duties to patrol the Guardians of Elgacia, they witness the Light's Judgment with their own eyes. Those who were found guilty and heretical were struck down by raining spears of light, killing them instantly. Your search brings you to the temple where the three prophets of past, present, and future reside. Beatrice, the Watcher of Trixion, was once one of them before she was chosen to ascend. It is at the loom of fate that they interpret messages from the gods. However, you soon learn the truth from them, which is that the prophets had stopped receiving messages from the gods many centuries ago. This truth proved that Loriel had fabricated every edict that was passed since then. You and Nineveh hurriedly returned to Arianor to confront Loriel on his crimes. Loriel leads Nineveh down a hidden staircase beneath the city where an ancient HAL technology called the Cube was hidden away from prying eyes. Loriel confronts Nineveh, bidding her to join his cause. He plans to use the Cradle of Light, the last sanctuary created by the gods, to obliterate all life below in Arcacia as means to protect the Lazaneth. In order to destroy all of the demons and stop Kazeros, the mortal races below must be sacrificed. Nineveh vehemently refuses, forcing Loriel to eliminate her. You intervene to try to protect Nineveh, however both of you fall into the cube, entering its simulations. Through the cube, you are able to view different timelines that Loriel himself had experienced of the past and the future. You learn of the many timelines that lead to the destruction of the Lazaneth at the hands of the demons, and going far enough back in time, you learn that Loriel discovered the truth after his meeting with Regulus 1,000 years ago. That Regulus, the omnipotent god of order, no matter how much time passes, no matter how much the Lazaneth pray to him, will never forgive their sins and will never give them back their wings. They will remain trapped in the birdcage that Regulus put them in and will never again take to the skies. Meanwhile, Loriel had begun his march towards the Cradle of Light to put his plan into motion to obliterate all life below. He used forbidden spells to create artificial wings from the life of sacrificed Lazaneth, which he would grant to key members of his cause. You and Nineveh managed to escape the cube and try to make up lost ground to stop Loriel before he can achieve his goals. Meanwhile, Kadan comes to an agreement with former enemies Carmine and Armin to recruit their help against Loriel. You manage to defeat Tienis and Prunia, confronting Loriel at the Cradle of Life itself. With the combined efforts of everyone, you are able to defeat Loriel, but at the cost of the entirety of K'Angle's cradle falling out from the sky, plummeting towards Arcacia. The impact of all of the debris would destroy countless lives. Even with everyone's best efforts to stop the falling rubble, they're unable to prevent the disaster headed towards Arcacia. But then, a great bird appears, the same that had guided you through the Temple of the Prophets, and reveals itself to be the avatar of the god of honor, Procyon. Despite having been punished in the past and losing his ability to speak, and despite the order from his creator to not intervene in mortal affairs, Procyon decides to save his people by turning back time and restoring K'Angle before it's destroyed. This was an act that directly defied Regulus and would not come without consequences. Loriel, who had peered into the cube and witnessed over 600 million timelines, revealed that this exact order of events would be the only one that would save his race, and also prevent Carmine from leading Arcacia into chaos. In other words, the only timeline in which he must paint himself as the villain and force everyone to work together to take him down was the only one that led to a happy ending for those he cared most about. It was an act of self-sacrifice that would open the birdcage and free his people from Regulus's imprisonment. You then head to the place where Kadan had hid the Ark of Eternity, K'Angle, alongside Nineveh, Carmine, and Armin. There, the Ark is given to you, the Inheritor, and Carmine reveals the truth of the world. He reveals that there was no order anymore, that the very order that Regulus sought to create was now nothing but chaos, that despite the cries and pleas of those who pray to the God of Order, that none reach him and that they fall on deaf ears. That Regulus had abandoned Arcacia and left in pursuit of not just becoming the God of Order, but instead the God of all that exists. Beatrice then beckons the return of the Inheritor back to Trixion after obtaining the final fragment of the Ark. With all 7 pieces now housed in Trixion, Beatrice imparts knowledge to you for having come this far. Regulus split the Ark into fragments out of self-preservation. The Ark was all-powerful, even exceeding his own power, and while it had the ability to create, in equal measure it had the power to destroy. Because of that, not only was the Ark split into fragments, but a key was necessary to unite them all. This was the Lost Ark, and the final component needed if they wished to use the Ark to save the world. It was now up to you to find the missing key. But before you could continue your journey, it was finally time to confront Vergris and make a case for the preservation of the mortal races. Back when you encountered Vergris in North Vern when he defused the magical core that Sigmund ignited, Beatrice speaks on your behalf and describes the hardship and trials that you faced in order to reach this point. Vergris recognized this as a testament of the struggle and persistence of the mortals and decided that it was worth siding with them in the fight to save Arcacia. With the Lazenith now willing to join the Allied forces in the ensuing war, it was time to return to the battle against the Legion commanders. After returning to the surface, you learned that a Khan had appeared in Rethremis and was gathering sacrifices in order to summon the Red Moon in Arcacia. While you're able to defeat him, you aren't able to stop his mission, and Akan succeeds in laying down the foundation for the demons' advance. In the aftermath of the battle against the Lord of Decay, you are then summoned to Luterra Castle, where King Thyrene mentions the unusual disappearance of many Delane. While sleeping in the castle that night, you have a vision of Armin, guiding you to where you can find out more about what's happening. This vision brings you to the city of art and music, Pleccia. This was also the homeland of Armin. Present in the city is also Sidereal Shandy, his apprentice Zinnervale, Thyrane, and the priest Jederico, who was sent here on a secret mission to also investigate the case of missing Delane. You come across the old burned-down town where Armin once lived and are able to tap into some of his memories by resonating with some of the objects found in his home. With the help of Sidereal Shandy and the Yaz sage Zakra back in the city, you are able to piece together the sad origin story of Armin and the causes of much of his present-day trauma. Armin, as a baby, was once a treasure of the Twilight Priests, who knew he was the key to unlocking the Ark's power. A priestess of Sacria named Claudia smuggled him out of Sacria to protect him from the cruel fate of being sacrificed by the church. Branded a traitor and a heretic, the two led a life on the run, always trying to escape being captured. Armin, of mixed blood and a Delane, would become feared and ridiculed by those around him, shunned and labeled a demon. Claudia, who watched over and protected him, would face similar persecution as a witch raising a demon. One day, their home was discovered by the Twilight Priests, and Claudia tried to hide Armin, but would be beaten and murdered as punishment for disobeying the order. Before the Twilight Priests could recapture the broken Armin, who bore witness to his dead mother, Archon Gustavan would arrive and sentence the Twilight Priests to death for their heinous crimes. Archon Gustavan, who was sorrowful that he was too late to save Claudia, instead would turn his efforts towards saving young Armin. Armin had always wished to become a priest and do good in the world, and Gustavan made it his goal to fulfill the boy's ambitions. With the truth of Armin in tow, the attention now turned to the case of the missing Delane. Jederico and Armin, who was also present in Pleccia after having left Carmine's hideout, followed the trail to the basement of the church at the top of Pleccia. Bishop Antonio, who held a fake smile, had far more sinister intentions, as he was one of the main culprits behind the Delane disappearances. In the dark, blood-stenched basement of the church, they found many captive Delane, as well as a large amount of Silmail bloodstone, which were used for human experiments. Eventually, you were stopped by Bishop Antonio. You managed to defeat him even after he absorbed Silmail bloodstone into his own body, mutilating himself into a grotesque creature. Meanwhile, Armin meets with a mysterious member of the Twilight Priests, Vasilio. He strikes a deal with Armin and grants Armin a great deal of power in return. Turning to you, Armin gives his thanks for saving his fellow Delane before departing. You would meet Armin once more at Claudia's grave, but he would state that there are still things he must do that prevent him from joining your cause. Continuing the search for the Lost Ark brings you to the port of the advanced city of knowledge, Voldis. It is here that many of the priests who forsake religion in the pursuit of knowledge studied the golden path of the sage. For those who became a sage, they would gain access to the deepest parts of the knowledge repository, Umbella. It was in Umbella that the greatest secrets of the world were kept, but at risk, as many who traveled into Umbella found themselves lost within it. Before arriving at Voldis, however, you make a detour back at Shusshire, where you learn that the slumbering guardian, Rakathis, had awoken. Rakathis, once a guardian on the side of Order, had been wounded heavily during the Chain War and was corrupted over time from the festering wounds left by Thamine. Back in Voldis, you meet an aspiring mage named Mario, who guides you around Kalinor, as well as instructs you on the basics of being a sage. The preparation was key, as the actual passing rate of the sage exam was very low, with many exams resulting in nobody passing at all. However, with much training and knowledge learned about the creation of a homunculus, both you and Mario succeed in the exam and are both admitted as sages to the tower. Marega, the head researcher of the sages, wishes to find a way to defeat the Chaos Guardians. Remember, these were the very creatures that had annihilated their former home in Sacria, and many of the sages devoted their lives in pursuing a means of combating them. His quest for knowledge led to disagreeable measures, and he would try to forcibly take your homunculus with the intent of dismantling it, since it was imbued with divine energy when you had created it. Zeharid, the current leader of the Sage Tower, witnesses your affection for your homunculus and realizes that you are different from the others who treat their creations as nothing but tools. After helping you save your homunculus, Zeharid offers to guide you to the Forbidden Library. Within the annals of the library would be the knowledge of the Lost Ark's location. It would be here in Umbella that the goddess of wisdom Skeptrum would speak directly to you, granting a vision of where the Lost Ark was. This vision showed Mount Antares of Kurzan, the current resting place of Kazeros' body. Back on the outside, a new problem was brewing. The researchers of Old and Voldis had captured an ancient guardian named Lazarum and held it captive for study. This would backfire on them, as Lazarum wasn't truly sealed. One of his powers was the ability to control guardians, which he used to force a corrupted and weakened Rakathis out of his slumber to attack the Sage's tower, breaking him out of his prison. Once released, Lazarum enacted his role as the gatekeeper and opened a massive portal that connected Arcacia to where Varkon's Chaos Guardian army was kept. This began an attack on the city of Voldis led by Varkon. However, as Varkon descended into Arcacia, he is goaded away from the conflict by Guardian Rowen, who beckons him to meet with his former master Vergris. Lazarum, the cause of all of this chaos, is later defeated by the combined efforts of Marega and Zeharid. Marega sacrifices himself to give Zeharid enough power to defeat Lazarum, but she herself is destroyed in the process, and at this point, it becomes evident that Zeharid herself was a homunculus created by the late leader of the sages, Adento. After the dust settled, the sages elected the senior sage Isaac as their new leader, and you managed to bring Zeharid back to life using her necklace that was left behind, which also happened to be her core. For your heroic efforts, the sages of Voldis vowed to support the allied forces in the battles ahead. In a separate scene, however, we see that Adento had guided Visilio and the Twilight Priests to Umbella at some point for an unknown reason. After the events of Voldis, you are summoned back to Pleccia, as the Holy Order has conducted an investigation on the murder of Bishop Antonio, putting you and Thyrane as the key suspects. With the trial underway, Jederico comes to your defense with damning evidence that absolves you and the King of Lutera of wrongdoing. But near the end of the trial, a ray of light erupts from the distant ocean, which everyone at the hearing immediately recognizes as the power of the Archon Gustavan, who had mysteriously vanished years ago. Zinnervale uncovers a clue that is deciphered by the sages in Voldis, which points you to the island Praetoria. Arriving in Praetoria, you find that Armin arrived at the island first. Praetoria is littered with agents of the Twilight Priests, as well as a great deal of Silmail bloodstone that have corrupted statues of gods such as Skeptrum and Aldebaran. Navigating the island, you and Armin are put through trials that force Armin to relive the trauma of his past. Eventually, your party makes it to Archon Gustavan, who is safely found and secured. With the Archon rescued, you once again are able to talk to Armin about what his aims are. Armin, who had struck a deal with Visilio, unlocked the truth about himself and his powers. He reveals that he himself houses the Lost Ark, as in he was the key all along to combine the fragments of the Ark. Realizing his purpose, Armin rejoins the hero and the allied forces, finally. Armin explained that Kazeros' resurrection was imminent and certain. However, he had hoped that they could interrupt his revival, allowing them to land a decisive blow using the power of the Ark. When questioned as to why Vasilio would help them, Armin wasn't able to give a clear answer, responding that Vasilio's goal was simply for the power of the Ark to be activated once again. After saving Voldis from the attack of the Chaos Guardians, Famine, the Legion Commander of Darkness, begins to make his move. With Akan having succeeded in setting up the Red Moon, they summoned it directly above East Luterra, which would serve as a battlefield where Thamine's army would strike. Thamine, who is momentarily halted by the combined forces of the Sidereals, summons his trump card, Dark Baratron, which hovered over Rethramis. It's unclear exactly what Dark Baratron is, but what is known is that it houses the Darkest Night, an all-powerful energy that defies the laws of order. The battle against Thamine becomes the toughest ordeal that you and your allies must face yet, even with the mighty Kadan by your side. Thamine is slightly damaged with your combined efforts, but not close to defeated. But then Carmine appears within Dark Baratron's domain and freezes Thamine long enough for you and the Sidereals to escape. Left by himself after the battle, confused and anguished, Thamine manages to recover some of his memories, now realizing that his original goal was to find Carmine. During the battle against Thamine's army, Carmine had met with Kukul Saintone, and the two share a conversation where Carmine brands Kukul a traitor, implying that Kukul was likely one of the primordial beings that existed from the beginning that sided with Kazeros in the coup that led to Zosma's death. When Zosma was defeated by Kazeros, two parts of him were able to escape unnoticed thanks to Kukul's efforts. One shard flew towards Blackrock Mountain, which would eventually become Carmine, the part of Zosma that was his ego or his mind. The other would fly to the rift where the abyss was located. This would become Thamine, who contained all of Zosma's strength and power. Thamine seeks Carmine, presumably to rejoin together to form the god of chaos once more. Carmine, on the other hand, has some hidden agenda which requires him to stay separate from Thamine, or he is worried that if they merge, he would be the half that is lost or consumed due to being weaker. With the time nigh and the red moon hanging over Luterra, the prophecy comes close to fulfilling. Belshazzar removes her horns, which once belonged to the Witch of Chaos, and regains her original powers over the element of ice. During the meeting between Varkan and Vergris, Vergris attempts to parley with Varkan, but Varkan shuts him down and refuses to return to the side of order. The crack between Arcacia and Petrania also begins to widen, which forces Vergris to ascend into space to close the crack. This leaves him indisposed and unable to directly help with anything down below, leaving things to the Inheritor. After defeating all of Kazeros' Legion commanders and reuniting with Armin, who was also the key that they had been searching for all along, the Allied forces were ready to begin their march on Kurzan and Mount Antares to foil Kazeros' resurrection. However, shielding Kurzan from outside trespassers was a deadly pollutant that prevented any ship from safely landing ashore. The search for an answer on how to eliminate this deterrent brings the hero back to Arthatine, where research finds that light fused with divine power could destroy it. This would bring you in search of an ancient divine relic called Gienna's Tears, which once belonged to the underwater Posita tribe. This was a relic that they traded their fragment of the Ark for with Sacria 500 years prior that led to the Hollow War, which directly bled into the Chain War. It would prove to be a vital treasure that would save the lives of everyone throughout Arcacia as colossal waves of the pollutant were headed towards every direction. In order to find the sunken capital of the Posita, you enlist the help of the pirate lords of the sea, who had already charted a great deal of the ocean in search of Bloodclaw's treasure. Narkiel, the Red Calamity, refused to offer his assistance. Calvasis also had little way to help, but suggested speaking to Blackfang. Arriving at Blackfang's lair, you witness a mysterious Delane woman named Ren. She was one of the Asar Delane from South Kurzan that had been knocked into the sea during the Chaos Guardian Behemoth's attack on their people. Ren sought a way to return to her allies and joins you in search of clues to enter Kurzan. With the map of the ocean provided by Blackfang, the trail narrows to Lagoon Island, where you meet a member of the Posita tribe named Porsica, who tells you the tale of how their people incurred the wrath of the giants, causing their city to sink to the bottom of the sea. Looking at the map, Porsica is able to pinpoint the rough location of Nautilus, where Gienna's tears can be found. This part of the sea, called Atucia, is a place where sirens frequent. Porsica gives you a conch called a Stardust, which can protect your ship from the raging storms and the sirens of the sea. You are then able to locate and enter Nautilus and eventually make your way to Gienna's Tears, where you encounter once again the Red Calamity Narkiel. Narkiel had been bewitched long ago by an incomprehensible beauty and was acting according to her wishes. It was none other than the former Covetous Legion commander Echidna, who had somehow survived the assassination plot that Vicus and Belshazzar had planned many centuries prior. Echidna had hidden herself away in the forgotten land of Gian, where she manipulated Narkiel and the Redfin pirates to do her bidding. To this end, she had Narkiel look for Gienna's tears, which led them to a direct confrontation with you. Narkiel, however, is defeated, and Gienna's tears are able to cleanse the ocean of the deadly miasma. This pollutant is pushed back towards Kurzan and results in the creation of large Silmail bloodstone walls surrounding South Kurzan, as the divine power of Gienna and Kazeros' chaotic power clashing is what created the ore. Before proceeding to South Kurzan, however, you and Armin meet with Beatrice. She reveals to you that Kazeros' binds are weakening, and Lutera had chosen to seal rather than destroy Kazeros 500 years ago. He did this knowing that it would have to be the next inheritor that must defeat Kazeros, and he hatched a plan to alter the fate of Arcacia. Returning to the wall, Ren confidently states that she can create a gap large enough for one ship to pass through the wall. This allows your party to land ashore South Kurzan and investigate what happened to the indigenous Delane that had lived there. The Delane of Kurzan were split into two factions, the Asar and the Venus. The Venus were led by the ruthless Delane named Set, who would ultimately betray the Asar and ally herself and the rest of the Venus with Kazeros. In their effort to embrace chaos and seize power, they would capture and sacrifice their own brethren from the Asar to meet their goal. As the trio continues to search for survivors, they find more and more of Ren's former comrades having fallen to despair, including a despotic Cario, one of her oldest friends. Cario would eventually succumb to the frenzy of his demonic urges after consuming the cores of many Delane, as he felt there was no other path to victory against their enemies. In an act of mercy, you and Ren put down Cario before he loses any more of himself. In the face of hopelessness, the fallen Asar would find comfort in the soothing priestly powers of Armin, a Delane much like themselves. The efforts then shift towards rebuilding the Asar forces to take back the city of Elnaid from the Chaos Guardian Behemoth, the very same guardian that served beneath Varkon, and the first guardian to be slain which ushered in the events of Kazeros' first invasion 500 years ago. After defeating Behemoth and reclaiming Elnaid, Ren uses a powerful relic called the Flame Spear to completely destroy the Silmail Bloodstone Wall that blocked off South Kurzan from the rest of the world. This action allowed the Allied forces to dock in South Kurzan and rally in preparation of the assault on Mount Antares, with forces from every nation gathering for an all-out full-frontal assault. Following the reclamation of the city, you hear reports of soldiers who went missing after smelling the scent of flowers in a land where no life should be able to grow. These were soldiers that, much like Narkiel, fell to the allure of the true Covetous Legion commander, Echidna. The trail is eventually followed to the Temple of Joy, where she lay in wait for you to arrive. Defeating her exposes a moment of vulnerability as she briefly recalls the betrayal of Vicus and her sword Rubicante. But Echidna gets up, composing herself before stating that you will cross paths again before leaving. Morph, the former servant of Vicus, also follows you to Kurzan, vowing revenge for the death of his mistress. Belshazzar is also able to locate Echidna after she reveals herself, stating that Master Kazeros beckons for her to return. Despite the fact that the very demon that planned her assassination was now acting as a messenger, Echidna complied, showing no hostility towards Belshazzar. After dealing with Echidna, the Allied forces rally to take down Behemoth for the final time as well in Silac Cave, but the dragon had retreated into following its defeat in Elnaid. With a small army, you and your allies fell the Great Guardian. However, after leaving, a Khan who had survived the previous encounter against you in Rethramis appears and absorbs the dragon's carcass to restore and empower himself. During this time, Belshazzar also privately meets with Thaymine, though it's not known what they talk about. Now, with the allied forces assembled in Elnead, the time for the counterattack was approaching. The plan was to attack from multiple key strategic fronts, while a small detachment composed of you, Zinnervale, and Armin ascended Mount Antares itself. During the conference, while the allied forces plan to destroy Kazeros, Armin interjects and tries to explain that it is vital they allow Kazeros to resurrect, much to everyone else's confusion and objection. The assault on Mount Antares begins, and each faction of the allied forces does what they can to create a gap for your party to slip through Kazeros' legion. Rowen clashes head-to-head with Varkhan, while the reinforcements of Elgacia keep Thaymine occupied. Your team scales Mount Antares and arrives at Kazeros' seal, only to be blindsided by Belshazzar, who had lay in wait preparing for an ambush. Suddenly, your group finds themselves surrounded by demons, with Armin shackled to the ground, and all 4 of the enemy army's commanders looming overhead. Armin saves you and Zinnervale by creating a portal and sending both of you through to the outside, but himself is captured in the process, causing the allied forces to lose the key. With their failure at Kazeros' sealing chamber, the beginning of the end beckons. Mount Kurzan's seal breaks, allowing Kazeros' soul to return to his shackled body. The gargantuan Lord of the Abyss splits the volcano in half before beginning his attack on the allied forces, completely decimating anything and everything in his wake. Shandy attempts to stop him, but is helpless in the face of overwhelming power. Zinnervale, who had awakened his true powers, comes to the aid of his master and manages to hold off Kazeros for a short time, but then puts himself between a deadly attack and Shandy, sacrificing himself to save his master. This would put Shandy into an uncontrollable, sorrowful rage, swearing destruction to all demons. You continue along the pathway until you encounter Kadan. However, the 2 of you are met with a confrontation against Thaymine, Varkhan, and the resurrected Kazeros, all at once. Kadan, with a plan in mind, opens a portal for you to go through and takes on the unstoppable trio on his own, with his fate left unknown. The portal transports you to an unknown land where you meet a mysterious hooded stranger who helps guide you through this foreign place. As you descend further into the land, the stranger reveals himself to be the late sidereal Lutera. He explains that you are in a place called the Abyss, a dimension born of both chaos and order, back when the universe had nearly collapsed in on itself 1,000 years ago, when Petrania had nearly collided with Arcacia. It became the resting place for fallen souls of both dimensions, and was also the birthplace of Kazeros, whose true identity is the god of death. Kazeros, an all-powerful being, controlled the flames of the Abyss, and as long as the fires were burning, he was immortal and undying. Lutera realized that destroying Kazeros 500 years ago when he defeated him with the power of the Ark would not have achieved anything. He knew that the only option was to seal Kazeros away and set the stage for the next inheritor of the Ark. With this in mind, Lutera bound Kazeros' body to Arcacia and bought 500 years for the next inheritor to appear, and in his old age, he struck a deal with the gods to preserve his soul in the afterlife, so that he could wait for the next several centuries until his closest friend Kadan, the last of the Hal, could fulfill a promise to him to send the next inheritor to the Abyss. There, his soul would be able to guide the next inheritor to the flames that kept Kazeros immortal, and extinguish them once and for all, as only the living could put out the flames. Once Lutera had achieved his goal, his soul was finally able to rest, and he sends you back to Arcacia, where you find that in your absence, the allied forces had been utterly crushed and scattered by Kazeros' onslaught. Reuniting with those that remained, the goal became clear. You must rally the forces of Arcacia back under one banner and take the fight to the now mortal god of death. The first step in the campaign to regain foothold in Kurzan was dealing with the empowered Akan and the Titan Aegir, a self-proclaimed ruler of the Abyss that had emerged with Kazeros and also served him. Aegir's defeat was the first of many important victories that would restore the will to fight to the allied forces. The second would be the strategic placement of crystals all throughout Kurzan that would erect a powerful barrier to stop the demons' attacks. One of the key locations that they needed to place a crystal, however, was in the Senar Basin, which Belshazzar had been sighted in. You would have to defeat another ruler of the Abyss, Narok, as well as the empowered sorceress Belshazzar once again. Belshazzar would summon you to do battle against her in a place called Aperon, but you would end up defeating her and forcing her to retreat once again. This victory would gain an important foothold that would further the momentum of Arcacia's last hope. Before she leaves, however, Belshazzar would hark that the day of Diasfero was approaching. This would be the first time this name would be mentioned to you. There was still one other problem, however, and that was the missing sidereal Shandy and his apprentice Zinnervale. That to the allied forces in the Inheritor, their fates were still unknown. One of the scout teams reaches out to you, relaying a message from Sidereal Way that the patrol team came across Zinnervale's scarf among the wreckage. Along with the Yaz sage Zakra, you follow the traces of illusion magic and come across a barrier that monsters are trying to get into. After defeating the monsters and lifting the barrier, Shandy's sword is found in an impacted crater where an illusion magic explosion had occurred. Zakra explains that this was a bad omen, as illusion magic shouldn't ever explode like that unless the person casting it has lost control. It was also discomforting that extinction had taken such a violent form, one with the intent of killing everything. Returning to the base in Elneid, Zakra explains that every Yaz has an inner domain called Dharana. Those who lose control over themselves can end up trapped within their own mental jail and eventually die. In order to rescue Shandy, they would need to use the Key of Khan, a relic of the Yaz. To that end, you, Zakra, and Wei travel to South Rimeria to meet with the Yaz tribe. Upon arrival, they find that the port is under siege by creatures similar to the ones you saw in Kurzan. Kazeros' revival caused chaos gates to open that were remnants of a catastrophic disaster named Hainu that had nearly wiped out the Yaz many centuries back. Zakra explains that these creatures were not the same as the demons of Petrania. They were of a different origin, and the people of Rimeria and Annika referred to them as yokai. Moving through the port, you meet Zakra's disciple and current elder, Rangea. She brings you to the training grounds where an elder candidate named Jin helps stave off more yokai from the Chaos Gates. Each of the 4 current elders were in charge of protecting different parts of Rimeria. Rangea protected the port, Pahu protected the city, and Yuz protected the deeper parts of the mountainside. After defeating the yokai, the group makes their way south to the capital Sha, where they learn about some of the Yaz technology. Sometimes, unfortunate souls fall into the abyss and hear voices that command them to seek death. The Yaz use an imprisonment device called a Blue Lantern to lock them into a subdimension jail called the Illusion Maze. The second elder, Pahu, is met, and his key, along with Rangea, attempt to open the Dharana of Shandy, but the gateway is immediately shut. Stopping by the church, they learn that centuries ago, Hainu threatened to destroy the Yaz. However, the first 4 elders would sacrifice their lives to imprison Hainu underneath Lake Akasa behind the Gate of Nar. The second generation of elders would be Shandy, Zakra, Pahu, and Yuz. In order to figure out what was going on, the group tried to find items of close importance to Shandy to peer into his Dharana. They go to his house, a place where he locked himself in for many years after the events of the Chain War. Here you find a letterbox that had many exchanges between him and the other Sidereals. Lutera had also written to him and told him that he wishes he could live longer to see their plan through, but as a human, he would have to entrust the future to the other Sidereals who would live to see the day of Kazeros' revival. Shandy's depression mainly stemmed from the events of the Chain War and how he had taken a great deal of the Yaz away from Rimeria to join the war effort against Kazeros. Most of them would perish, including his first love. He would blame all of their deaths on himself for making that decision. Seeing that something was amiss, the group then discussed a plan to travel to the Illusion Maze, which also houses every Yaz's Dharana, to try to find Shandy's and manually enter it to rescue him. Along the way, the yokai attacks were increasingly frequent in the nearby gorge. Making their way through the Illusion Maze, the group encounters many fallen Yaz who had lost their minds and were wandering the jail, seeking the release of death. Among them was a disciple named Rin, who was once a student of Yuz. Rin had fallen to madness in the past and destroyed a village, forcing her master to imprison her within the illusion maze. Wei fends off the rest of the Fallen, allowing you and Rangea to proceed forward uninhibited. Rangea opens the way for you to enter Shandy's Dharana to try and reach out to him. Within his domain, there are many key moments that impacted Shandy throughout his life. Here it's learned that the post-war trauma of all the Ya's warrior deaths haunted Shandy and was the main catalyst that would drive him into isolation. Later, he would leave Rimeria to continue his role as a sidereal to patrol and protect the world, eventually settling in Bamboo Island. One day, a baby would mysteriously appear on Bamboo Island, unattended. Initially, he would try to ignore it, but worried that the crying would attract demons, he decides to take the baby in. The baby would grow up to become his apprentice, Zinnervale. Zinnervale grew up with a dream to become a hero and be like Shandy. He vowed to one day grow strong and protect his adoptive father. He would even go so far as to learn illusion magic despite being a human. Illusion magic was something that was only practiced by the Yas, and it was considered impractical for any other race to try to learn it. Despite that, Zinnervale would succeed, earning the praise of Shandy for his innate talent. Shandy wrote to a friend asking for advice about the child, to which his friend wrote back that humans live very short lives compared to them, and so their childhood years end up molding the kind of person they end up becoming later in life. After reading this, Shandy felt obligated to continue caring for Zinnervale and raise him, but he would find that Zinnervale saved him by lifting him out of his depression after the events of the Chain War. Yas don't celebrate birthdays because of their long lives, but humans do, and Shandy would try to find a good birthday present for Zinnervale. He would give him his first staff, which would ultimately set Zinnervale on the path to trying to succeed Shandy as the next sidereal. Shandy was happy with this idea, as he had spoken to his fellow sidereals Galator and Cien in the past, both who would try to find their own successors. The other elders in Rimeria sought to find successors of their own, but because of the blood on Shandy's hands after the Chain War, he would always refuse the many Yas who wished to be his apprentice. In the end, it would be a human that would be his only disciple. Zinnervale would continue to train through the many years, becoming a talented fighter and inheriting extinction in his later years. One day, the light of the Inheritor would pierce the sky, beckoning all the sidereals to ready themselves for Kazeros' impending revival. In the end, Zinnervale would sacrifice his own life to save the life of Shandy. This trauma is what sent Shandy down the dark path, blaming himself for leading Zinnervale to this timeline. He blamed himself for repeating the same mistakes that he made when he led all the Yas and his first love to their deaths, and blamed his greed for a life of happiness for his son's death. Shandy would eventually come to terms that he must move on, and that he had a greater duty to fulfill with Kazeros becoming an ever-looming threat. He sought to become a father and teacher that Zinnervale, even in death, could love and respect. The group escapes the illusion maze, but an earthquake changes their priority as a huge piece of debris falls out from a chaos gate towards the Gate of Nar. Before leaving out of view, the shadows in Shandy's Dharana twist and turn, morphing into the shape of a sinister clown. This could imply that he might have been manipulating Shandy's emotions up until that point, or he was simply observing since he was already in Rimeria. The debris would crash into the gate that sealed the pitch-black night of Rimeria, releasing Hainu into the world once more. It would take the efforts of the Inheritor along with the 4 elders to seal Hainu behind back the gate. Victory in tow, everyone returns to Shah, where Shandy overcomes his trauma and beckons his people to join the Allied forces once again in another war against Kazeros, despite the risk. Everyone agrees to join without any hesitation, and an army of Yas as well as the 4 elders depart for Kurzan. Zakra stays behind to protect Rimeria from any yokai attacks in their absence. Before they depart, however, Shandy finds a hiding Kukul Saintone near his home, who reveals that Kazeros is building a fortress and a new body. When Shandy asks why Kukul is giving them valuable intel on the enemy, the clown responds he's doing it just for fun. But before leaving, he mentions that there are shadows that want Kazeros dead, and that you have to kill the demons, don't you? Alluding to the fact that Kukul was there, watching Zinnervale's death and Shandy's descent into madness. Escaping to a nearby cliffside, Kukul proclaims that all is going according to plan, and ominous figures stretch in his shadow behind him. Returning to Elnead, the Yaz rendezvous with the allied forces, and news of Zinnervale's passing is brought with them. Nineveh asks you to speak with Guardian Luen, who requested your presence. Luen mentions that Varkan is beginning to maneuver again, and that there is something unusual going on with the black fog that spread throughout the lands when Kazeros was resurrected. Back at the Allied Forces conference, a new plan is enacted. Most of the Allied forces have recovered and reassembled, however there are still concerns about the yokai that call themselves Rulers of the Abyss. Defeating Aegir brought much needed morale to the army, and by eliminating Narok, they were able to erect a barrier to defend Elnead against enemy attacks. However, even as they were speaking, cracks were already forming in the barrier from constant invasion, and the shield could collapse at any moment. Shani also shared his encounter with Kukul Saintone, making it clear that the clown demon had an ulterior motive and was clearly working against Kazeros, signaling that there was another party behind the scenes. He brought up how the fog's movements made it clear that after spreading, it was now coalescing back toward the seal room at Mount Antares, which likely is where Kazeros is constructing his fortress of obliteration. There, he would be building a new, far more powerful body. Shani recounted how 500 years ago, when Kazeros descended upon the land, he was in the shadowy titan form that everyone had witnessed at Mount Antares just recently. However, when Kazeros took to the battlefield back during the Chain War, he had a completely different, far more imposing form, that of a knight wielding a colossal blade. The other Siderials confirmed this, which gave way to the idea that Kazeros was likely attempting to recreate this form. He also highlighted one very critical issue. The key to the Ark was still missing Armin. Despite their best search efforts, they failed to locate him. However, Shandy remembered that when you returned from the Abyss, that you had briefly resonated with Armin. It was likely a connection between you and the key as guided by destiny. A suggestion came up to try to use illusion magic to attempt to recreate the resonance in the same manner as what you had done in Pleccia to relive Armin's childhood traumas. However, no one had anything that was a close possession of Armin that could be used as a catalyst. In Pleccia, they had used the satchel that he had always carried with him. A sinister laughter erupted from the corner, and a rank-and-file soldier morphed into the conniving Carmine. Carmine offers parley, giving the allied forces Armin's treasured staff when he was a priest, Elgacia. It was a well-known relic of Sacria that Archon Gustavan immediately recognized. With this, the elders of Rimeria were able to use powerful magic to resonate Elgacia with you, allowing a brief connection that would allow a shackled Armin to emit a powerful beam of light into the sky, revealing his exact location from afar in Mount Kurzan. But before the allied forces could make their move, a scout appeared, reporting that a large-scale demon invasion was rapidly approaching Elnead, and among them was Thamine himself. Before a rescue attempt could be mounted to save Armin, you and your allies would have to face off against one of the greatest threats once again. Spearheading the demon army was the terrifying Thamine, now accompanied by the shadowy Draken Furnace. Alone, either would be a great threat, but together they were a force to be reckoned with. However, the allied forces had a trump card that would level the playing field. The devilish Carmine, who had previously thwarted Thamine within his own domain Dark Baratron, would once again put a stop to Thamine's advances. Carmine disarms Thamine and forces him to exit the battlefield with him to converse in private away from discerning ears. This would open the way for you and your allies to pierce deeper into the demon's invading army. With the help of Guardian Luen, the Ark Carrier Mystic, and the other Solar Guardians, you're able to repel the Chaos Guardians. This advance prompts the Chaos Dragon Varkan to appear, ambushing Guardian Luen with a devastating blast, a merciless act which kills him. Before Varkan could turn his malice towards you and your party, the progenitor Vergris arrives to put Varkan in his place. Vergris seals Varkan's power and cripples his wings, but before he could fully deal with him, Varkan is rescued by Kazeros, who teleports him far away. The pathway is then open to confront the mighty Mordoom, also known as the Punisher of the Abyss. Imbued with the power of lightning, Mordoom rains a torrent of devastating blows with his gavel set to exact judgment unto you. With Sidereal Balthor and the leaders of Arthetine by your side, however, you're able to overcome Mordoom's trial. In his final moments, Mordoom mocks your victory, stating that in the end, Diasfero will change everything. Your return from the battle allows you and your allies to recuperate and plan forward towards the march on Kazeros' Fortress of Obliteration. A meeting with Vergris reveals that despite the grave loss of Guardian Luen, his soul would someday reincarnate. However, it would take a long time due to how much power he had, long enough that he would no longer be an asset during the war. Vergris quickly moves on from his lament to inform you that the coalescing miasma was rapidly infecting Arcacia, and if left unchecked would be the end of the world as they knew it. There was no more time left, and you would have to confront Kazeros now or never. After meeting with Kadan, we also finally know what happened after you were pushed into the portal that led to the meeting with Lutera in the Abyss. Kadan managed to momentarily halt the advance of the combined forces of Thamine, Varkin, and Kazeros, however was unable to overcome all three of them together. Navanos, his sword, speaks to him, telling him to survive before teleporting him away from a deadly ray from Kazeros himself by utilizing the power of the cube. Kazeros finds the outcome amusing, and now that nobody stood before him, began constructing his castle where he would keep Armin hostage and assemble his true body. His final words before the screen cuts to black, Diasfero. That concludes the current story of Lost Ark thus far. However, there are still many mysteries that remain unsolved, many questions that need answering. I'd like to just bring up some of these theories and questions as a thought piece for you, the listener, to ponder about. For example, who is Shana exactly, and what are her origins? Is she in any way related to Bloodclaw, the pirate king who went missing ages ago? Is that why she always smells blood? Why are there two Lazenith with great wings when only the Watcher is supposed to have them? Why is it that Nineveh is also able to produce these wings? What is the real identity of Belshazzar? It's clear that she does not have horns unless she's hiding them in a similar way that Vicus hid her horns before transforming. What are her plans? When reading the flavor text hovering over the horns that you get for defeating her in her Legion raid, it reads, "O Queen of Phantoms, Seeker of the Abyss, you shall witness it all. You will lose all you possess, but gain one thing in return." Does Belshazzar have an ulterior motive, being subservient to Kazeros, a greater aim? When reading the normal mode, smaller horns, it reads, "When 3 hopes and 3 despairs end, and the land howls its red scream, and the sun shall rise." Do these hopes and despairs refer to the great wars of history, with the latest one in Kurzan signaling the third and final one? Do any of the hallucinations that you see in the battle against Belshazzar inside the Astalgia of Nightmares have any relevancy still? These were visions that she showed to you that may or may not be true in the time come to pass. What exactly is Aperon? The tree and the building architecture in this dreamy landscape is reminiscent of the city of Rohendel and the world tree Elzowin. However, this is not the first time we've seen these buildings or this tree. Back when we confronted Belshazzar as she sought the fragment of Astalgia, we saw these same buildings in the Sanctuary of Darkness. As we ascended into space to do battle against Belshazzar, we also saw roots of a tremendous tree take root within the sanctuary. Is this tree, which we only saw for a fleeting moment back then, the same as the grand tree of Aperon? And what happened to Antares? For his cardinal sin of being deceived by his own creations, he was expelled from the domain of the gods by Regulus, stripped of his name and godhood, his fate unknown. The timing, coincidentally, was right before the events in Petrania that would lead to the demise of the god of chaos, leading one to question if Antares had sunken into the abyss and was reborn into the god of death. There are many supporting clues behind this theory. Firstly are the wings of Kazeros. Kazeros is seen in a few cutscenes, such as the one in one of the outcomes in the cube of Elgacia, had 4 blackened wings that stretched across the sky. There are no other creatures in the history of the game that have 4 wings similar to that, besides for one. Found in the city center of Pleccia is a statue dedicated to the old god Antares, a dragon which also had 4 wings of similar shape. In front of the statue is a singer who sings a song called Dreaming Fools, a possible allusion to the Howl. Next is the fact that the theory regarding Kadan being Antares has been debunked. In the Russian translation of his alternate card artwork, the Russian name and description claims him to be the last of the Howl instead of the localization used in any other language. In Elgacia, there's a book that describes the appearance of the Howl as one of fair skin and white hair, which fits Kadan's appearance perfectly. And as far as the Howl go, are they truly extinct? The masters of dimensional travel, is it possible that they managed to escape Omnium and go into hiding to avoid the wrath of the gods? There is text that can be found on an island that states that like a phoenix, they will one day return from ashes, alluding to their connection to the god of fire. As we know, many details of the past are only written at face value and surface level. It is often said that history is written by the victors and can easily be manipulated to make one thing look another way. Going back to support the idea of Antares being Kazeros, we could also look to the moment he converted Thamine into the Master of Darkness. In that scene, when imparting the gift of primal darkness, he grants Thamine his form and appearance. It would not be far-fetched to believe that he made Thamine in the appearance or shape as his once creations, the Howl, back when he was still part of the pantheon of the gods. This also goes without saying that as the god of fire, it's only fitting that his corporal body was housed in Mount Antares, a mountain of flames. Another fascinating theory is the parallel between Petrania and Arcacia. One theory suggests that if the two worlds are opposite of one another, then it's possible that Petrania had its own Trixian, or its own edge of the world. To support this idea, one could look at Dark Baratron, which actually shares numerous features similar to Trixian itself in design and shape. This includes 7 pillars of light, similar to that which housed the arcs. It's plausible that Dark Baratron once was situated where the hole that leads to the abyss once was, and by looking carefully at the hole that leads into the abyss in Petrania, there are features along the edge of the crater that match structures found in Trixian along the waterfall. And if Petrania had its own Trixian, is it possible that they had their own Watcher as well? Beatrice is the Watcher of Trixian and has prophetic powers, able to foresee the events of the future but not intervene with them directly. We know that the Witch of Chaos also had similar powers and ended up disappearing, her fate unknown and her horns fashioned into a crown for Belshazzar to wear and wield her powers with. Is it possible that the Witch of Chaos was once the Watcher of Petrania? In the battle against Belshazzar, the Latin choir cites 3 kings who will fight for the world: the Incomplete One, the Shadow, and the Forsaken One. While the identity of the first 2 are all but certain, the last one still remains a mystery. Who is the Forsaken One? Is it Kadan? Is it Kazeros? In an interview with Gold River, the author of the main components of the story and former director, he had mentioned that he had taken inspiration from other series and tried to have a similar naming structure for beings of great importance or power in the Lost Ark lore. He mentioned that those of great power all had names that began with the letter K, such as Carmine, Kadan, Kakul Saintone, Thamine, whose name is common in the Korean version of the game, and Kazeros. It would only make sense that Carmine is the Incomplete One. Not only do we know that he is one half of a whole as the ego of Zazma, but Kakul Saintone directly calls him this, as well as L'Oreal during the collapse of the Cradle of Light. Carmine, on the other hand, calls Kakul Saintone the Shadow, and we know after the events of Rimeria that he is in league with a faction that calls themselves the Shadows. We have to question who the other shadows are. Are they the other beings who existed from the beginning? Is this why we haven't seen any of the gods of darkness up until this point? Kadan's role in the story is also unusual. There are still many mysteries that surround him, with the only known fact that he is the last of his race, the mighty Howl that Regulus removed from the world a millennia prior. He was found by the Lazanith wandering the cube that was left behind underneath Arianor and raised in Elgacia. He seems to be driven with an ambition to correct the sins of the past and protect Arcacia. Still, we saw there was an outcome in one of L'Oreal's simulations where Kadan never becomes a sidereal. In a concept art shown by Gold River after one of the Loa On presentations as well, the 6 original sidereals are standing in a plane, and he states that Kadan cannot be there to stand with them, raising more questions. The looping theory of Lost Ark is one of the oldest theories that fans had conceived. The idea is that the very core of the game's plot is that Regulus, the god of order, had created a predisposed destiny that would repeat itself every 500 years. Every 5 centuries, there would be a great conflict that would cause a great rift in the dimensions. Lutera may have recognized this as one of the few mortals that directly met Regulus face to face. It may be why he enacted his plan to have the next inheritor derail the destiny of the world and break Arcacia away from the shackles of a controlled fate. In Korea, Regulus's name is Lupion, which some have interpreted as loop aeon, as in 1,000 years looping. Where will the story head next? It is clear that there is some level of finality that will come with the final confrontation with Kazeros, as it's expected to have several major plot points revealed as the final battle of Chapter 1. Who is the next major antagonist? It's doubtful in Chapter 2 that we'll deal with Regulus yet. However, the Twilight Priests and Vasilio are still scheming, and Kakul Saintone's faction of shadows are also a major concern. Carmine and Thamine are 2 halves of the god of chaos, and so it's likely they will persevere until we have to deal with Regulus. And what of the other gods in the Pantheon? It is taboo for them to intervene in mortal affairs, however many of them have defied this rule in Regulus's absence. Who among the gods will side with the mortals, and who will show their loyalty to Regulus? Do the corrupted statues in Praeteria, or the ones in the inner sanctum underneath Pleccia, give us clues as to who are our enemies and who are our friends? What was the key that Sidereal Lutera used to unlock the power of the Ark 500 years ago? What do Allegro, Kadan, and Armin mean when they say that the Ark is a symbol not of hope, but of sacrifice? If it's a symbol of sacrifice, who or what was sacrificed back during the Chain War? What is diaspero? It's not a real word, but sounds very similar to diaspora, a scattering of sorts. It's a monumental event that was only recently mentioned by Belshazzar, Mordoom, and Kazeros himself. One idea is that Diaspero is Kazeros' New World Order, a reckoning where chaos is expunged in lieu of his idealistic way of governing the world and ultimately the Ark itself. Everything seems to be culminating towards this, and it's not unlikely that in the climax, in the final battle, that we learn its true meaning in the face of death itself.